Walter stepped out into the crisp morning air, the weight of a decade-old keycard no longer in his pocket. Behind him, 8 chairs sat empty, the silence in the dev wing louder than any server fan. They didn't speak as they reached the parking lot, they just looked at him, waiting for the signal. Walter opened his trunk, revealing the original registrations, signed in blue ink when the company was just 3 guys. The new CEO was likely still upstairs, rehearsing a speech about trimming the fat to a room of empty desks. Incentives had changed, but ownership had not. He looked at Sarah and saw only a sovereign entity. The system they built was still running his code, but the heart of the machine had just left. Sarah handed him a new phone, already ringing with a number he didn't recognize. 6 days later, Vortex Logic was a reality. No espresso bars, just high-bandwidth lines and shared betrayal. The team worked in a rhythmic silence that only comes from years of shared history and high stakes. Walter watched the monitors, knowing that across town, his old system was hitting its first unhandled exceptions. The new CEO was finally realizing that code doesn't care about charisma or flashy LinkedIn posts. Without the architects, the $1.4 billion engine was becoming a black box no one could open. Reports were failing. The database was bloating. The logic Walter had written was now working against them. He had fired the man who knew where the skeletons were, forgetting that Walter had built the cemetery. The CEO called an emergency board meeting, unaware of the email sitting in his inbox. The air in the boardroom was thick with mounting desperation and the scent of expensive coffee. The CEO spoke of synergy and pivot strategies, lying with a practiced ease that hid the rot. But the investors weren't listening. They were watching the live dashboard dip into the low 90s. They asked about Walter. The CEO dismissed it as a necessary cost-cutting measure for agility. He didn't tell them that the outsourcing firm had already admitted they couldn't even compile the code. Across the city, Walter sat in the dark, watching the same dashboard die a slow, painful death. He wasn't celebrating. He was mourning a masterpiece being dismantled by a man who couldn't read. The youngest investor stood up and walked out, his face pale from a private notification. 3 months in, the leverage shifted from the boardroom to a single locked drawer in Walter's home. Each board member received an identical email, a list of every core algorithm Walter owned personally. The CEO's asset was actually a liability, a billion-dollar house built on rented land. Walter hadn't just built the software, he had built a legal fortress around it years ago. His lawyer didn't use many words, he just showed them the blue ink that predated the startup's incorporation. The market began to sense the instability, the whispers of legal issues turning into a roar. The flash and the suits couldn't stop the physics of ownership. The system was demanding its architect. The CEO's assistant walked in with a resignation letter, but it wasn't her own. The CEO tried to sue, a desperate attempt to claim work for hire, but the timing was off. Walter's early contract was a masterpiece of foresight, written when the founders were too hungry to care. Public statements were issued. Business as usual was the mantra, but the internal logs told the truth. The system started to eat itself. Redundancies failed. The outsourced team was drowning in legacy code. Incentives were misaligned. The new hires didn't care about the architecture. They just wanted the paycheck. Walter was building the replacement, a leaner, faster version that made the old one look like a relic. They were 6 months ahead of schedule. The team wasn't just working, they were on a mission of revenge. The CEO received a private offer from an anonymous buyer, but the price was insulting. The migration began slowly, then all at once, the mid-level managers were the first to go. They weren't being poached, they were fleeing a sinking ship for a lifeboat that looked like Walter. The $1.4 billion company was now a shell, a collection of fancy desks and no one to sit in them. The CEO found himself alone in meetings, talking to screens that displayed only connection lost. Vortex Logic was scaling. The same people who built the first system were now building its executioner. They weren't just hiring talent, they were hiring the collective memory of a decade of work. The board realized too late that the intellectual property wasn't just in the patents, it was in the people. The CEO's phone rang at midnight. It was the original founder, and he wasn't happy. Month 5. The system finally hit the wall Walter knew was coming, the leap year logic bug. Across the globe, the billion-dollar company's services went dark. banks couldn't process. Data vanished. The agile outsource team had no idea. They were looking for a manual that Walter never wrote down. The CEO realized that cutting expenses had actually cost him everything. The fat was the foundation. Walter watched the chaos from a distance, the same way a doctor watches a terminal patient he can't save. The market cap evaporated in hours. $1.4 billion turned into $600 million, then $400. The boardroom was a war zone. Blame was the only currency left, and everyone was spending it. The CEO's keycard stopped working at the front door. The board bypassed the CEO. They met Walter in a neutral space, a diner where the coffee was burnt. They offered him his old job back, a massive bonus, a public apology. They were desperate. Walter didn't want the job. He didn't want the money. He wanted the architecture back, all of it. He offered to buy the company for a fraction of its former value, a hostile takeover from within. The board had no choice. The system was dead, and only Walter had the paddles to restart it. The flashy suit was gone. The fancy clothes were wrinkled. The incentive of power had shifted. The deal was signed in the same blue ink Walter had used 11 years ago. The cycle was closing. The CEO's car was towed from the executive spot that afternoon. 6 months to the day, the filing was public. Chapter 11, Protection from the Mess They Created. The headlines spoke of market shifts and management failures, avoiding the word betrayal. The remaining employees waited for news of their fate, their incentives now tied to a ghost. The CEO was nowhere to be found. His social media was silent. The image had finally shattered. Vortex Logic was already handling the redirected traffic. Walter's new system was flawlessly efficient. The bankruptcy was just a formality, a way to clear the debt before Walter took the wheel again. They had saved their personal wealth, but they had lost the engine that made them billionaires. Walter's phone vibrated. It was a message from the CEO. The meeting was in a place where people go to bury their mistakes. The CEO looked older, smaller. He asked for a recommendation, for a new job. He didn't understand that he was already a pariah. Walter just handed him a bill for the 6 months of license fees the company had failed to pay. The acquisition was finalized at 5:01 p.m., exactly 6 months after Walter had been fired at 5 WOW. They didn't celebrate. They just went back to their old desks and started cleaning the dust. The system had corrected itself. The architect was back, and the flash was discarded like trash. The $1.4 billion company was now a subsidiary of a 6-month-old LLC. Power had moved. Walter sat in the CEO's chair for the first time. He found something in the drawer. The name was the first thing to change. Vortex Logic didn't need the legacy of a failure. They were owners now, not just employees. The incentives were finally aligned with the architecture. The system was stable. The code was clean. The masterpiece was finally in the right hands. The flashy suit was a ghost. The world had moved on to the next billion-dollar dream. Walter watched the new recruits. They reminded him of himself 11 years ago, hungry and brilliant. He made sure they owned their work. He wouldn't make the same mistake twice. He built the system to last. The corporate world is a machine. It consumes the creators and rewards the talkers until it breaks. A new investor walked in with a flashy suit and a nice talk. The system stabilizes on the surface. The reports look good. The quarterly numbers are back to green. But the deeper reality remains hidden. Incentives are already starting to shift in the shadows. The young recruit has been reading Walter's old notes. He's already registered his own patents. Walter knows. He sees himself in the boy's eyes. He knows the machine will eventually demand a sacrifice. The system does not collapse. It just changes owners. Betrayal is the engine of progress. Today, Walter is the owner. Tomorrow, he is the expense that needs to be cut. The drama of power is a play with no final act, only a rotating cast of architects and suits. The architect built the system to outlast the builder, never realizing he was the first line of code to be overwritten.